Well, thank you for coming. It's a very proud moment for me as Executive Director of the Menzies Research Centre. This is the first publication that we put out since I took over the role in July. A think tank is about ideas, and it's about promoting ideas. And for all the excitement and benefit you can get from the internet and from Facebook and everything else we use today, there's nothing that beats a hard copy publication with good, empirical, useful data in it that you can use to push good ideas to get good policy in action. So that was the thinking behind this series, the R.G. Menzies essay. And I'd first of all like to say how privileged we are to have Heather Henderson with us here, so that we can have her with us to give us Menzies' blessing, I guess, on this project, and hope that this in some way it carries on the great tradition of ideas, of liberal ideas that Robert Menzies started and made concrete with the formation of the Australian Liberal Party, or the Liberal Party of Australia, and then of course with that long period of government which built modern Australia, as we know from a recent book. But the Menzies essay series is an idea that we had to get ideas out there, to present a forum for ideas, not necessarily that people have to agree with, but they will, we hope, contribute to the public debate in a positive way from the centre of Australian life, from the centre of Australian politics, the place that Menzies held for so long. Because while there's so much commentary out there, so much talk and chatter, it seems to me what we're crying out for are voices from the sensible centre, and that's what we'll be presenting in the R.G. Menzies essay series as it continues. I'm very proud to say that, slightly embarrassed perhaps to say that in a series which is there to promote the future of Australia, the advance of Australia, the progress of Australia, we have to turn to New Zealand for our first issue. But many people have observed, I think especially since the election of John Key for a third time in August, that something's happening in New Zealand for the last 6 years that hasn't been happening here. While we had 2 terms of Labor government obsessed with personalities, obsessed with the periphery, the frippery of politics, the photo opportunity, the press release, in New Zealand they've quietly been getting on with some serious reform, and in the process equipping New Zealand for this, as we like to call it, Asian century. Oliver Hartwich is a man who is probably one of the best authorities on this. Oliver brings a global perspective to this region and to New Zealand. Oliver started out his life as a staffer in the House of Commons in London. Sorry? House of Lords, even better, even better. Senator, with respect. And then went on to join the Policy Exchange think tank, where he worked with helping David Cameron in opposition with some ideas, some of which I think Cameron accepted, some of which he pushed to one side, but that's by the by. He then came to Australia and worked for the CIS, which is where I and many others of us got to know him, doing some really solid work there, putting the Australian story in the global context, and particularly his analysis where he was comparing Australia with Europe was very sharp and very important at that time. He then went on to New Zealand to head the New Zealand Initiative, which is from where he's come with great authority and great perspective to talk to us about the reforms that the key National Party government has carried out, where New Zealand's heading, and perhaps, dare I say it, in Minister Cormann's presence, there are some lessons there for Australia too. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Oliver the Minister first, and then Oliver to say a few words. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. It's a great privilege for me to be launching this first Menzies essay here today, Quiet Achievers, the New Zealand Path to Reform, in particular in the presence of Heather Henderson, and also my good friend Senator Bob Day and the High Commissioner for New Zealand, Chris Seed. Now, the most important lesson out of this book, in my view, is that if you want to know where you're headed, or if we want to know as a country where we're headed, the most important thing is to look at the trajectory we're on. The trajectory we're on is way more important than the starting position. What I would refer you to there is, in particular, when you read the book, there's a graph on page 34, which shows very clearly that back in 2007-2008, after nearly 12 years of strong coalition government, the Australian economy was stronger than the New Zealand economy. We went into the global financial crisis here in Australia in a stronger position in terms of our budget, in terms of our economy, than New Zealand. But if you look at what has happened in New Zealand since the global financial crisis, on the back of the reform agenda pursued by the key government, they have been able to get themselves into a better position than we did here in Australia. And I thought that Nick was being quite benign in the way he described the actions of the previous government. If personality fights and press releases was the only thing that they had done in their 6-year period in government, we might have got away more easily in terms of the impact on our quality of life, the strength of our economy and living standards and the like. The problem is that unlike other governments around the world, unlike the government in New Zealand, which focused on New Zealand's international competitiveness, which focused on reducing the cost of doing business in Australia, in New Zealand. Here in Australia, we had a government that kept putting more and more lead into our saddlebag, arguably at the worst possible time. I mean, when we talk about a repeal of the carbon tax, repeal of the mining tax, getting rid of unnecessary red tape to reduce the cost of doing business in Australia, these are not ideological pursuits. These are not things that we are doing out of, because it was a political campaign slogan. These are things that we're doing because we think it is so important to put Australia back on a stronger trajectory for the future, a trajectory where we're more competitive internationally, where we can grow the economy more strongly, where everyone has the opportunity to get ahead, and of course where ultimately we are able to grow jobs again for people across Australia. When we came into government in September last year, we inherited a weakening economy, rising unemployment, low consumer and business confidence, and a budget in very bad shape. Now we are one year in, a bit over a year in, and there's still a lot of more work to do. But if you look at the foundations that we've been able to put in place over the last 12 months, we believe that we are on a similar trajectory to the one that has been pursued in New Zealand now over 6 years. And of course the opportunity for us is that in 5 years from now we'll be able to look back on similar achievements, and then maybe in 5 years from now in New Zealand somebody will write a book about the Australian experience and how people in New Zealand can learn from us. But I mean, just to sort of dwell for a moment on that point in relation to the trajectory before launching the book formally. Here in Australia we know that this is true too, right? Because we have been on a different trajectory in the past too. Back in 1996, the coalition government then inherited a situation where the budget was in need of repair, where there was a need for economic reform, and after a serious effort to repair the budget, after a serious effort to initiate economic reform, we gave ourselves the space to pursue tax reform, which in itself continued to give us the opportunity to build a stronger, more prosperous economy, and we ended up in this virtuous cycle that New Zealand is in now. Our objective with what we're trying to do here in Australia now is to get ourselves back into that virtuous cycle where in 4 or 5 or 6 years' time we can look back and say, okay, how did we get here from that really challenging position back in 2012, 2013? New Zealand is 5 years further down the track than we are because they've had 5 more years of good government. After 5 more years of good government here in Australia, hopefully we'll be able to demonstrate that it is ultimately the trajectory that we're on that is going to determine whether we'll be able to improve our living standards, improve opportunity into the future instead of detracting from it, as sadly happened over the previous 6 years. So without any further ado, thank you so much again for inviting me to launch this. This is a very important contribution to the public policy debate here in Australia. I commend it to you. And hopefully in 5 years from now we'll be able to have a conversation on how the Abbott government have been the quiet achievers and have taken Australia on a strong path to reform that has led to increases in living standards and improved opportunity for all. Thank you.
Thank you. So now without further ado, I'll introduce Oliver to talk briefly about his own book.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Minister, for your kind words about the publication. I think there's something we share. We both arrived in Australia as migrants from Europe, and I think you had a very similar experience that I had. I really enjoyed the Australian buzz that came out of the great reform period of the 1980s and 90s, and I compared that back to Europe. And I often reported back to my European friends. I wrote for European newspapers and said, you should look at Australia, this is what reforms can do, and this is what you can achieve if you go about them. Then I worked here, and I must say, I think it's probably another thing that we share, the frustration of the last few years before you took over, of how this great reform experience ended, how we experienced a reform holiday, and how suddenly we seem to be going into reverse. And especially for the last few years that I lived in Australia, it felt more like a traditional European experience at times, but that's not why I had migrated. So I was getting increasingly frustrated before I left for New Zealand, when I got my job offer there in 2012. But it was actually quite a strange choice for someone who really believes in reforms to move to New Zealand at that time, at least, because I was swimming against the current. At that time, there were about 40,000 Kiwis every year leaving New Zealand for a supposedly better life across the ditch here. And when I arrived in New Zealand, I had to explain my choice more than once to Kiwis who asked me, why would anyone in his right mind leave Australia for New Zealand and Sydney for Wellington? Not even talking about the weather here. But the narrative has changed a lot in the last couple of years. And what I realize increasingly is that we are now seeing a very positive view of New Zealand reported in the Australian media. And sometimes I must say, as someone who still reads both newspapers from New Zealand and Australia, the narrative seems to be quite different in New Zealand. So I compare in the paper commentary after John Key's re-election this year, and you read the Australian press and you get the impression that this is a reformist Prime Minister with a very ambitious reform agenda. Peter Hatcher in the Sydney Morning Herald actually called him a neoliberal activist. I'm looking at the New Zealand High Commissioner. I think nobody in New Zealand would call John Key a neoliberal activist. That is a very alien way of putting it for New Zealanders. And the starting point of the publication was really then to figure out who's right. Are the Australian commentators right who believe that John Key is the most reformist Prime Minister New Zealand has seen in at least a generation? Or are some New Zealand commentators right who complain that he is a ditherer, someone who really doesn't have any vision and really procrastinates his way to reform? And I think in this case, I actually side with the Australian commentators because I think they've got it right. Why do the Australian commentators have it right on John Key? Because I think the way John Key goes about his reform business requires you to step back a little bit and look at the broader picture. It doesn't quite occur to you when you're too closely linked and too closely involved, because sometimes the reforms in New Zealand happen at a snail's pace. But it is a strategy that I describe as incremental radicalism we are observing. And I think the analogy with the picture that you sometimes see more clearly when you step a little bit back and then you see the patterns, whereas if you really too closely looking at it, if you're standing right in front of the picture, you wouldn't quite get it. So what we're seeing in New Zealand is profound change. We are seeing profound change in a number of areas. We saw radical tax changes, a cut in the income tax to just 33% top rate, which compares effectively to, what is it now in Australia, 48, 49% once you include all the different levies. So it is a much more lower tax country nowadays. We compensated for part of that with an increase in GST to 15%. We had substantial changes in New Zealand in the field of welfare. Welfare policy changed substantially under the leadership of the Honourable Paula Bennett. It was a long process, prepared well with a welfare reform working group and then executed in John Key's second term. We also witnessed that we have extremely good fiscal management, and I think Bill English is doing an exemplary job as Minister of Finance and Deputy Prime Minister with a real focus on bringing the budget back to surplus. And if you just take into consideration that New Zealand didn't ride on the back of a mining boom, that on top of that it had to deal with the substantial devastation left behind by the Canterbury earthquakes. It is quite a remarkable achievement that Bill English is looking likely to return the budget to surplus next year already. In the book I'm trying to then identify how the Key government goes about its business and what are the leading characteristics of the reform approach chosen by John Key. And I identify 4 Ps. I think I might add maybe another couple of that on second consideration. But let me just talk you through the 4 Ps that are in the book. The first P that you notice with John Key is preparation. There is a lot of time spent preparing all the public policy reforms that I just talked about. The welfare reforms took a full first term just to agree on what was needed to be done, and then another term to implement the changes. With this first P, preparation, comes the second P, and that's patience. Not everything needs to be done at once. If I had one criticism for your government, it was that you were perhaps too ambitious to do everything in just one budget. And sometimes that's asking too much of the population who you would like to take on your journey. And Key is a master in doing just that. So he is establishing his case for reform, he's taken the population with him, and nothing ever hits the public by surprise. Everything is well prepared, maybe with the exception of Hikia Parata's initiative on class sizes. I see a smile on your face. But that is really the exception to the rule. The third P that Key demonstrates is pragmatism. He is not afraid of second-best solutions if that's what he can get. He wouldn't stop any meaningful reform process because he can't get his first-best solution. He will implement the second-best solution and keep working on improving that. So far, with the 3 Ps of patience and preparation and pragmatism, I could have also described Angela Merkel. But there is a 4th P that really differentiates John Key, and that's principles. Because I think if you are only a pragmatist, you are pretty good at probably managing the day-to-day business of the government, but you have no idea where you're leading it. There's a wonderful saying about Angela Merkel, actually it was a social democrat who said it, that Angela Merkel is a wonderful pilot. And you would have no hesitation boarding a plane piloted by Angela Merkel, except you shouldn't care where you land. With John Key, it's the opposite. With John Key, you know exactly where you're going because his instincts are all in favor of economic reform, economic liberalism. This is where he wants to take his country. So you take these 4 Ps of preparation, principles, pragmatism, and patience, and you've got Key's recipe for success. And the other 2 Ps I might add now, which I probably should have put in as well, is passion, because he is someone who's passionate about New Zealand, passionate about making this country a great success, making it the best little country in the world. And performance, because Key is someone who really runs New Zealand as a small country, but rather like a big corporation. The word that Key knows best, of course, from his days at Merrill Lynch. So had Key not chosen his vocation as a politician and taken this job as Prime Minister, he probably would have been an investment bank CEO by now. And this is exactly how he leads his cabinet. So for the ministers who perform really well, they get little guidance and Key lets them do their jobs. For the ministers who take a little bit more guidance, they get it. For the ministers who probably take too much guidance, they are out. Key can be a ruthless operator and a ruthless manager of his cabinet. I think once you take all of this together, the 6 Ps by now, I'm still struggling to find more, I think you get a good picture of who this John Key really is and how he leads his country. He does it very successfully. It is benefiting him personally. His approval ratings are phenomenal for a politician after 6 years in office. It works really well for his party that came just 1 seat short of reaching an absolute majority, which is unheard of really under New Zealand's stupid electoral system of MMP, which was imported from Germany. And it is actually working well for New Zealand because you can see that the growth figures for New Zealand in the last 3 years were actually slightly stronger than Australia's. New Zealand has overtaken Australia in competitiveness terms. It's now ranked 17th on the Global Competitiveness Index.
Who said it in New Zealand?
But MMP. We have all the complications that you have in the Senate in our lower house. If you want to swap, I think I would take your bicameralism and give up MMP instead. But there are some structural differences, of course, which we shouldn't deny, which probably make reform a little bit easier at times for a New Zealand Prime Minister. But nevertheless, I think this should not diminish Key's great achievement. He's a great leader. He is a great Prime Minister. He's leading New Zealand onto the right path. And I hope that by emulating his success and by learning the lessons from New Zealand's success story, Australia can get back on track and make it the great reform success story that I so admired when I first lived here. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Oliver. The one P you didn't mention, of course, is Palmer. I think that's what, the P that we have that you don't. But thank you, Oliver. The books are here for you to collect. I can just give you just a taste. I can't reveal who the author of the second Menzies essay will be, but I can tell you it'll be a very well-known figure, and it'll be a very substantial second essay, and that'll come out early next year. As soon as I have it in the bag, as soon as I have the manuscript, I shall reveal all. But thank you very much. If you want to add your name to our mailing list, there's a slip in the book that you can give to us. And Oliver, I'd just like to present you, before you leave these shores, with the book of the year, signed by the author.
Thank you.